Namaskar. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. From Florida Satsang Group, we have 3 items. First reading is from Mountain Path, October 1982, Volume 19 issue, editorial by A.R. Nadarajan's Secret Operation of Ramana's Grace, being read by Daksha Jadeja and Kanchan Parashar. Second, we have Varshita and Karan Balamurgan singing Sri Rama song. Third item is from David and Janet Rubinson. They chose chapter 10 from Tirupura Rahasya by Swami Ramanananda Saraswati. Spanish satsang will follow right after. Namo Ramana.
Secret Operation of Ramana's Grace. Ramana would always remind the visitors and devotees seeking assurance of his grace that it is there all along, that it is synonymous with God and the self. Ramana was emphatic about the self revealing immediacy of divine grace, and would compare failure to perceive it to the poor vision of the owl which cannot see the sun, or to those buds which do not blossom on sunrise. He once remarked, "People come and tell me that I must grant grace. They seem to think that I keep it under lock and key. I'm always giving it. If it cannot be comprehended, what can I do?" How then is His grace vouchsafed? What does it mean to be clothed and ornamented by His grace? Ramana's grace means different things to different people. It is ordinarily taken to mean His intervention for altering the course of events. The following illustrations are typical. A devotee suggested to her friend to keep Ramana's picture with her in order that her husband might return to her, and reported after some time in the hall that her prayers had been answered. Another devotee present in the hall asked, "What is impossible for Bhagavan?" adding that he had advised a friend that he could continue in Madras for physical proximity of Bhagavan, if only he prayed to him for that. Devotees would send telegrams and letters to Sri Ramanashram to be placed before Ramana for curing ailments of their dear ones. Even as the telegram or letter was being dispatched, there would be relief and miraculous cure, which would be attributed to His grace. Many instances are narrated in Day by Day with Bhagavan and Sri Ramana reminiscences of persons turning to him in their hour of need, and invariably getting succor. Ramana himself would, however, dismiss these visible signs of his grace as being only the automatic intervention of a higher power when matters were brought to notice of a jnani. The following conversation which Ramana had with Sri Subramaya is germane. "Bhagavan, did you not think that you must do something to save the child?" Straight came his answer. "Even the thought of saving the child is a sankalpa, and one who has any sankalpa is not a jnani. In fact, such thinking is unnecessary. The moment the jnani's eyes falls upon a thing, there starts a divine automatic action, which itself leads to the highest good." Such instances are no doubt important in kindling and sustaining faith in Ramana's divinity and the inspired nature of his teachings. The first overt act of grace, however, is the awakening of interest in the search for truth and for finding the meaning of life. To be saved from the quagmire and quicksand of a life of identification with the body, centered on the sensate pulls, is truly Ramana's grace. For millions are lost in worldliness. Remembrance is the forerunner of grace. That is the response, that is the stimulus, that is grace. To be exposed to the simple and direct path of Ramana for returning to the source, to a natural state of happiness, is the next step, as it were, in the chain of his directed grace, for one could lose oneself in the labyrinth of purely mental spiritual practices. For the search into the source of the ego, the vital sustenance and support is His grace, for that pushes the mind inward. Till one becomes established in the divine milieu, one undergoes the torture of one suspended between life and death. We're often in a halfway house, having neither anchorage in the self nor in the body. Old tendencies lash at us, as it were, forcing the mind outward, and the joy of self-abidance is too weak or intermittent to act as a countervailing force to pull the mind inward. At this juncture, grace is needed most. Ramana himself once quoted Nayana, that is Ganpati Muni, as saying, "In going forward, one can run any distance at any speed, but when it is a question of going backward, that is turning inward, even one step is hard to take." The capacity of the mind to be fully focused on the I thought is not strong enough on many an occasion. Ramana himself puts this situation very clearly in the marital garland when he says, "Seeking you with my weak mind, I have come back empty-handed. Aid me, O Arunachala." In the inward journey too, one could be lost by mistaking lulling of the mind as being the end of the journey. The case of Shankarananda, a devotee saved by Ramana, would serve to bring out this point. Shankarananda would sit for long hours in the hall. While meditating, he would be overtaken by spells of stillness of thought. To get him out of this state, Ramana would request Sri Kunja Swami and Sri Vishwanatha Swami to take him out to the temple or for a walk to the lake so as to draw himself out, for no further progress would be possible. Otherwise, it is Ramana's grace alone which enables one to cross this stage and push inward, deeper, to the zone of the self by giving the strength for persisting in the inquiry. Grace alone which enables one to cross this stage and push inward, deeper to the zone of the self by saving the strength for persisting in the inquiry up to the point where it is required before letting go, to be swallowed alive and becoming inundated by the sea of bliss of the self. Grace is thus the beginning and end. Introversion is due to grace. Perseverance is grace, and realization is grace. So important is grace for the search and for self-abidance that Ramana uses the expression as many as 51 times in the marital garland of letters.
Again, it is the grace of Ramana which enables us to be aware where exactly our true freedom lies. The first instruction which he gave to his mother was that events are preordained according to the divine law. In response to a question put to him, he would emphasize this fact. Ramana told Paul Brunton, "He who has given life to the world knows how to look after it also. He bears the burden of the world, not you." He would at the same time point out that the pathway to freedom lies in not identifying oneself with the body and by not being affected by pleasures and pains consequent on the body's activities. The feeling that we are utterly helpless and incapable of shaping events and circumstances according to our choices increases, and the ability to cast the burden of care on the Supreme Power who sustains all things comes about as one learns to let go and lose oneself in the flood tide of Ramana's grace. Self-inquiry and surrender is possible only by his grace, which operates unnoticed like the morning dew, cleansing the mind both of its self-regarding activity and its laziness. Borrowing his words, we often wonder who it is that has secretly entered the mind and stolen our heart. He is the secret treasure of grace, coming to us uninvited, without notice, biding his time to reach and destroy the vitals of our ego. The secret of this alchemy of grace is not known for like a spider. Ramana holds us tight in his gracious orbit to consume us at his hour. But one thing is certain, he is like the mighty Aruna hill, the life destroyer, and he too has raised the flag vowing the death of the ego of his devotees. It is for the reason that he would generally not encourage evaluation of one's spiritual progress. Once we have entrusted ourselves to his care he will, and it would be his concern to look after us. What indeed would have been our lot had he contented himself with just enjoying the bliss of self-abidance? But Ramana graciously accepts the responsibility and becomes our helmsman, our staff, and life in the spiritual journey. This is illustrated by two instances. Balaram Reddy would pay obeisance along with a loving offering to the Maharishi every morning and pursue self-inquiry in the privacy of his own apartment. He was not yet aware of the transforming influence of physical proximity of Ramana. Ramana noticed this. When his broad hint failed, he literally thrust his grace on Reddy by a mock anger, which made him realize the immeasurable advantage of questioning within in Ramana's presence. A leaf from Shri T.K. Sundaresa Iyer's diary is also worth extracting in this context. One day I wondered why I was visiting him at all. What was the use? There seemed to be no inner advancement. Going up to the hill was meaningless toil. I decided to end my visits on the hill. For 100 days exactly, I did not see Bhagwan. On the 101st day, I could suffer no longer, and I ran to Skandashram. Bhagwan saw me climbing, got up, and came forward to meet me. When I fell at his feet, I could not restrain myself and burst out in tears. I clung to them and would not let go. Bhagwan lifted me up and asked, "It is over 3 months since I saw you. Where were you?" I told him how I thought that seeing him was of no use. "All right," he said. "Maybe it is of no use. So what? You felt the loss, did you not?" Then I understood that we did not go to him for profit, but because away from him there was no life for us. The steady light of Ramana's grace will do its work shining like the golden rays of the rising sun, enabling us to abide forever, sunk deep in the ocean of bliss. Om Namo Ramana.
मुदित मन से कहो राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम। पाप मिटे दुख कटे लेख राम नाम, पाप मिटे दुख कटे लेख राम नाम। पव समुद्र सुखद नावे राम नाम, पव समुद्र सुखद नावे राम नाम। श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम। परम शांति सुख निराते नित्य राम नाम, परम शांति सुख निराते नित्य राम नाम। निराधार के आधार एक राम नाम, निराधार के आधार एक राम नाम। श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम। परम गोप्य परम इष्ट मंत्र राम नाम, परम गोप्य परम इष्ट मंत्र राम नाम। शांत हृदय संता वसंत एक राम नाम, शांत हृदय संता वसंत एक राम नाम। श्री राम राम राम, Shri Ram Ram Ram, Shri Ram Ram Ram, Shri Ram Ram Ram. माता पिता बंधु सखा सभी राम नाम, माता पिता बंधु सखा सभी राम नाम. पंत जनर जीवन धन एक राम नाम, पंत जनर जीवन धन एक राम नाम. श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम, श्री राम राम राम.
Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. We will be reading from chapter 10 of Sri Tripura Rahasya, which consists of a dialogue between a royal couple, Hemaleka and Hemachudha, which is entitled, On Further Instructions by His Beloved, he got samadhi in spite of his external activities and remained in the state of emancipation even while alive. Hemaleka noticed that her husband had attained supreme peace and so did not disturb him. He awoke in an hour and a half, opened his eyes, and saw his wife nearby. Eager to fall into that state once more, he closed his eyes, and immediately Hemaleka took hold of his hands and asked him sweetly, "My lord, tell me what you have ascertained to be your gain on closing your eyes, or your loss on opening them, my dearest. I love to hear you. Do say what happens on the eyes being closed or left open."
On being pressed for an answer, he looked as if he were drunk, and replied reluctantly and languidly as follows. "My dear, I have found pure, untainted happiness. I cannot find the least satisfaction in the activities of the world, as sorrow increases when they finish. Enough of them. They are tasteless to me, like a sucked orange, only indulged in by wasters, or like cattle, incessantly chewing the cud. What a pity that such people should be, to this day, unaware of the bliss of their own self, just as a man goes a-begging in ignorance of the treasure hidden under his floor. So did I run after sensual pleasures, unaware of the boundless ocean of bliss within me. Worldly pursuits are laden with misery, and pleasures are transient. Still, I was so infatuated that I mistook them for enduring pleasures, was often grief-stricken, yet did not cease to pursue them over and over again. The pity of it! Men are fools, unable to discriminate pleasure from pain. They seek pleasures, but gain sorrow. Enough of these activities, which increase the relish for such pleasure. My dear, I beg you, with hands clasped, let me fall again into the peace of my blissful self. I pity you that though knowing the state, you are not in it, but are ever engaged in vain."
The wise woman gently smiled at all this and said to him, "My lord, you do not yet know the highest state of sanctity, which is not besmirched by duality, reaching which the wise transcend duality and are never perplexed. That state is as far from you as the sky is from the earth. Your small measure of wisdom is as good as no wisdom, because it is not unconditional, but remains conditioned by closing or opening your eyes. Perfection cannot depend on activity, or the reverse, on effort or on no effort. How can that state be a perfect one if mental or physical activity can influence it, or if the displacement of the eyelid by the width of a barley grain makes all the difference to it? Again, how can it be perfect if located only in the interior? What shall I say of your muddled wisdom? How ridiculous to think that your 1-inch long eyelid can shut up the expanse in which millions of worlds revolve in one corner alone. Listen, Prince, I will tell you further. As long as these knots are not cut asunder, so long will bliss not be found. These knots are millions in number, and are created by the bond of delusion, which is no other than ignorance of self. These knots give rise to mistaken ideas, the chief of which is identification of the body with the self, which in its turn gives rise to the perennial stream of happiness and misery in the shape of the cycle of births and deaths. The second knot is the differentiation of the world from the self, whose being consciousness is the mirror on which the phenomena are simply reflected. Similarly, with the other knots, including the differentiation of beings among themselves and from the universal self, they have originated from time immemorial and recur with unbroken ignorance. The man is not finally redeemed until he has extricated himself from these numberless knots of ignorance. The state, which is the result of your closing the eyes, cannot be enough, for it is pure intelligence and eternal truth transcending anything else, yet serving as the magnificent mirror to reflect the phenomena arising in itself. Prove, if you can, that everything is not contained in it. Whatever you admit as known to you is in the knowledge conveyed by that consciousness. Even what may be surmised to be in another place and at a different time is also within your consciousness. Moreover, what is not apparent and unknown to that intelligence is a figment of imagination, like the son of a barren woman. There cannot be anything that is not held by consciousness, just as there cannot be reflection without a reflecting surface. Therefore, I tell you that your conviction, I shall lose it by opening my eyes, or I know it, is the knot awaiting to be cut, and there will be no attainment, though. Remember, it cannot be the perfect state if it can be attained. What you consider the happy state, as accomplished by the movements of your eyelids, cannot indeed be perfect, because it is certainly intermittent and not unconditional. Is any place found where the effulgence is not, my Lord, of the fire blazing at the dissolution of the universe? All will resolve into that fire, and no residue will be left. Similarly, also, the fire of realization will burn away all your sense of duty, so that there will be nothing left for you to do. Be strong, root out your thoughts, and cut off the deep-rooted knots from your heart, namely, I will see, I am not this is non-self, and such like. Find wherever you turn the one undivided, eternal, blissful self. Also, watch the whole universe reflected as it arises and subsides in the self. See the self both within and without you, yet do not confound the seeing self within as the seer of the universal self without, for both are the same. Inhere in the peace of your true internal self, devoid of all phenomena.
At the end of her speech, Hemachuda's confusion was cleared up, so that he gradually became well established in the perfect self, bereft of any distinction of within and without. Being always equable, he led a very happy life with Hemaleka and others, reigned over his kingdom and made it prosperous, engaged his enemies in war and conquered them, studied the scriptures and taught them to others, filled his treasury, performed the sacrifices pertaining to royalty, and lived 20,000 years, emancipated, while yet alive. The king, Muktachuda, having heard that his son Hemachuda had become a Jivan Mukta, consulted his other son, Manachuda. Both agreed that Hemachuda was not as before, but that he had changed, so that he was no longer affected by the greatest of pleasures or the worst of sorrows, that he treated friend and foe alike, that he was indifferent to loss or gain, that he engaged in royal duties like an actor in a play, that he seemed like a man always intoxicated with wine, and that he did his duty well, notwithstanding his absent-minded or otherworldly look. They pondered the matter over and wondered, then sought him in private, and asked him the reason for his change. When they had heard him speak of his state, they too desired to be instructed by him, and finally became Jivan Muktas, like Hemachoda. The ministers were in their turn desirous of attaining that state, and eventually reached it after receiving proper instructions from the king. So were the citizens, the artisans, and all classes of people in that city. All of them gained the summum bonum, highest good of life, and transcended desire, anger, lust, etc. Even the children and the very old people were no longer moved by passions. There were still worldly transactions in this ideal state, because the people consciously acted their parts as the actors in a drama, in accord with the rest of creation. A mother would rock the cradle with lullabies representing the highest good. A master and his servants dealt with one another in the light of that truth. Players entertained the audience with plays depicting truth. Singers sang only songs on truth. Court fools caricatured ignorance as ludicrous. The academy only taught lessons on God knowledge. The whole state was thus composed only of sages and philosophers, be they men or women, servant boys or servant maids, dramatic actors or fashionable folk, artisans or laborers, ministers or harlots. They nevertheless acted in their professions in harmony with creation. They never cared to recapitulate the past or speculate on the future with a view to gain pleasure or avoid pain, but acted for the time being, laughing, rejoicing, crying, or shouting like drunkards, thus dissipating all their latent tendencies. Dattatreya continued, "Thus you see, Parasurama, the primary cause of emancipation is association with the wise. Therefore, follow that advice first and foremost." Thus ends Chapter 10 on the section of Hemachoda in Tripura Rahasya.
Namo Ramana. This is the end of our program. We would like to turn it over to Spanish satsang. Namo Ramana.